And in this laboratory, I'm not asking you to submit any specific projects or source files. Instead, I want you to make changes in all of the in two of the header files, which is Dropbox and main window header file. So I want you to open Dropbox.h right here, and also open, so this is under Fluid project subfolder, and also in source main window.h. And we can start here. So I want you to document this code by adding comments in these header files on top of the names of the functions. And I want you to substantially explain in these comments how you understand what these functions are doing. And so the kind of like the standard to follow is to we have to make documentation for both classes and functions, and all the classes themselves and member functions. So for instance, for classes, brief single sentence description of the class. Basically, why do you have this class? What is the responsibility of this class? Right, so also you can write down above this class right here, what is the responsibility of this class? So you can say, for instance, for class main window, to give you an example, we can say that main window manages GUI window of our application. Right, so anything like this would work. And what is the responsibility of this class? So it's responsible for managing all callback, I would say callback functions that implement user actions. Right, so something like this. Basically, that would be. I don't know if this is an ideal description of the responsibility of this class, but really, if you look at it, it is mainly derives itself from the graphical user interface set of widgets and window, and then it just basically adds these callbacks to that definition of the graphical user interface window. All right, so this is how to document every class that you have in this example code. Then write information about hierarchy if the class has a base or derived classes. So just general idea that this is a base class for graphical user primitives, or this is the class that derives itself from that base. Obviously, this here derives not from graphical user, not from the primitive, but from the Fluid generated window. So just write down the idea of why is this happening, just in your own words, and write down any additional information about the class that you may be useful. So if you think about something, add to this sort of like standard type of information that I'm asking you to provide for each class. Then you can write it in. For every class data member, add substantially detailed comments. So the Dropbox is an example of this, right? So for instance, on the top of this header file, we have a definition of the primitive base. So here you can just write a few sentences that you know, the base class stores 2D coordinates of the primitives whatever, just a documentation like this, but something that really kind of makes sense, right? So again, it's sort of deriving from the responsibility of this class. So this class is responsible for storing all of this information and providing the base for the hierarchy of all graphical primitives that we support. So just you can write it at the top, or you can add it right here. But if you can describe the group of data members in one sentence, that's fine as well. And then, of course, we need to document all the functions. So as the function definitions occur, like for instance, this is a constructor, this is the default constructor. This is the draw function. So I want you to write documentation for all functions, and the standard to follow to document functions is that what is the purpose of the of each function parameter, right? So just obviously here it's pretty obvious that we have two coordinates and the color that this primitive base will encapsulate, and so forth. Then if function has a return type, like what does it return? And the example here is this function create primitive. It returns a pointer to dynamically allocated primitive objects that we manufacture inside this function. And I would describe the purpose of this function, create primitive. It's like a factory of drawing primitives, right? So we manufacture specific drawing primitive, and then we start using it to maintain appearance of circles, rectangles, and lines inside the user interface. What is the purpose of the function? Who calls this function and when? So you can it's not necessary for every function, but for a function like this, I think it deserves explanation. Who will be calling this function and when? Provide any additional information about the function that you may find useful. So just the same kind of standard. So in other words, I want you to add your comments following these guidelines to these files. Then what I'm also asking you to do is to essentially take basically Control A or select all and copy, okay, and paste the entire content right here. Just after your comments are added, I want you to copy and paste it right here. That's all I'm asking you to do for this header, and the same thing to do with the Drawbox. Once again, when your work is complete and your documentation of all pieces in this file are complete, Control A, copy, right? Copy and paste. So just provide the entire content of your work, of your documentation. And I'm really asking you to do this only in these two files, mainwindow.h and drawbox.h. Okay, so I'm going to save what I have here, and in our laboratory also there are some follow-up questions to answer. So this is regarding the Drawbox. For example, Drawbox vector primitives keep track of the shapes created by the user. What kind of data does this vector store? Of course, you need to find the definition of vector primitives. So it's possible to press Control F and use the search box. So that should give you a quick access to every place where it appears to be used. But this is where it's declared. So of course, keeps track of shapes, but what kind of data does this vector store? And you can of course specify that it's using unique pointer type of object like this, and explain briefly what unique pointer does. I encourage you to search for explanation of unique pointer online. and specifically I can the URL may change, but what I see here is this URL. Now I'm not asking you to give this URL back to me. I'm just asking you to look at this link, and you can find it inside learn.cpp and just locate this section 15.5, and it gives you an idea what the unique pointer does. So basically right here, this is you have to use your own words to describe what this unique pointer, why we're using it in our application, and what is the reason for it. And the second part of it, so if you just give me a short answer like this, then provide your description right here. What is unique pointer? What is its life cycle? What happens when its destructor is invoked? And of course, the purpose that we're using it is that our vector of primitives, when it goes out of scope, we should be able to destroy properly the objects allocated inside the vector. Why virtual destructor is needed inside our hierarchy of primitive shapes. Let's scroll back up to almost to the very top right here. A class primitive base declares a virtual destructor right here. So we discussed this in a lecture video, and it's just the rule that after virtual keyword is being used in a hierarchy, it's your responsibility to remember to add virtual destructor, because otherwise it may be simply unsafe to use such base. And in many cases, when objects are allocated dynamically, like we, by the way, do in our design, this becomes very crucial part. Otherwise, the objects will not be destroyed correctly. So explain how hierarchy of classes helps to dispatch function calls. We discussed this again in our series about class hierarchy and polymorphism. What is the syntax of the pure virtual function declarations in primitive base class? Of course, we have seen this, and that makes the draw function pure virtual at the base level. But if you look carefully, if I just make a selection of it like this, you see that here, when we define our primitive objects, the line is using FL line and all of this color manipulation. Then we have the circle, and the circle is using this code to make a circle. And if we go down here, primitive rectangle has its own version of draw, and here we use the this definition, and of course here's the another full-tick library function to draw rectangles with the currently selected color. So which function in the project serves as a factory of drawing primitives? We already discussed that this was in the new file drawbox.cpp. We have create primitive, and this is our factory of drawing primitives. How is it related to the radio buttons on the screen? Well, it just basically says what is the current type that you give me, and based on this type it will be creating dynamically will be creating objects of the requested type, right? So that's how it's related, and the current type is set by the user when they click the selection of the radio button. Okay, so which FLTK library functions are called to draw circles and rectangles? So again, back to the draw, you can observe the implementation of the draw functions here, and of course these are the examples of what we're using. So for instance, arc is making a 360 arc, which is pretty much the complete circle, if you will, right? So it's an arc, and here we're using the rectangle. Okay, so when you're done, just make sure that you, if you're not done yet, make sure that you save your changes periodically and submit when you're done. So this is the completion of this lab. You just submit this entire form, and this is our laboratory 15. So once again, besides filling in these answers, I'm asking you to, prior to starting to filling these answers, you should be documenting each class, right? So each class, like main window and radio selector, and then right here in this draw box, document what are these classes right here. So every class should be documented, and then every data member has to be documented, and then every function also needs to be documented. So primarily we have this arrangement. So we have the hierarchy that we have the primitive base, and then what derives from it. If I make a selection of it, Control C, Control F, right? So you can see that primitive line derives from it, primitive circle derives from primitive base, and primitive rectangle derives from there. So this is our support for drawing these shapes by creating these objects, and they know how to draw these shapes. Okay, so this is the overview, and make sure that you document the drawbox.h and mainwindow.h before submitting the copy by submitting the form.